What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, it's the Game Week 1 preview, a series that I'm going to run throughout the season, every single game week, looking through the hot topics and or answering your questions and giving you my opinion. If you're happy for it to be back, make sure to give it a like and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any videos this season. And if you haven't checked out Fantasy Football Hub already, there is 50% off at the moment. Links in the description below, and I'll show you more of the tools that you can use over there throughout this video. Let's get into it. So let's start with who are the best 5.5 million midfielders. So the list that I've put together is Smith Rowe, Minter, Brereton Diaz, Semenyo, Kamada and McNeil. There are other options as well, and I'll talk about some of them in a minute. But this is the main list for me. And realistically, if I'm going to end up with a 5.5 million mid in my squad, it's probably going to be one of the top three: Smith Rowe, Minter, Brereton Diaz. Everyone else, I've not written off, but I'm pretty sure they won't be in my final team. So why do I like Smith Rowe? It's the early fixtures. I think he's going to be pretty much nailed in that Fulham team and will start fairly regularly. And the early fixtures are just good. Even the first game week, Man United away, is not completely terrible. It's not a fixture you would pick, absolutely. But if you had to play him in that game, it wouldn't be the end of the world. And then straight after, you've got Leicester at home, Ipswich away, so two newly promoted sides. And then back-to-back home games against West Ham and Newcastle. And also, part of me thinks, you know, if you could get a goal in game week 1 and then people see that he's only 5.5 and he's got Leicester at home, then Ipswich away, he's the kind of player where the price could go up pretty quickly. So I think Smith Rowe is, at the moment, my favourite 5.5 because of those fixtures. We should say, or I should say, he's not perfect, right? He hasn't played for a very long time consistently. Like over the last 2 years, he's had hardly any minutes for Arsenal, partly due to just not being able to get into the team, partly due to injuries. We'll have to see how he reacts to playing more regularly. But I think given the money they've spent on him and how he's done so far in the couple of pre-season games he's played, I think he will start, and I think he'll start as long as he's fit. Minter, I think, is potentially more interesting. His numbers last year were 0.6 expected goals per 90, 0.27 expected assists. Now, that wasn't in the Premier League, and it is more difficult to step up to that level. But there's a lot of promising signs around him. People are talking him up as if he's going to be the next big thing. We'll have to wait and see if that happens, right? Because often players are talked about as the next big thing and then you don't hear about them a year or two later. But there is certainly encouraging signs to go for Minter. The reason that I wouldn't have him ahead of Smith Rowe is because I think in the short term, the fixtures are just worse. So you've got Everton away game week 1, Man United at home in 2, and Arsenal away in 3. And I think it's almost the opposite of Smith Rowe, that in game week 1, even if he does well, people might look at Man United and Arsenal next and not necessarily go for him. And if he does bad and people see the next couple of fixtures, he might actually be a player that possibly drops in price. I mean, this could be overthinking at this stage, but the thought did cross my mind. You've got Ipswich at home in 4 and Nottingham Forest at home in 5. That's when you really want to play him. But who knows whether Brighton will sign more players in the transfer window, what the minutes of Minter will be like. I think for what it's worth, they'll be pretty good, but I'm not sure I could guarantee that. And I think if the fixtures I really want him for are in 4 and 5 game weeks' time, I'm probably going to go for someone who's a little bit better in the short term. And then Brereton Diaz is an interesting one at Southampton. 0.38 expected goals per 90 last year at Sheffield United, 0.09 expected assists. Not bad for a 5.5. I think his minutes will be very good. And he did get, I think it was, let me just double check here, 6 goals and 1 assist in like 1,400 minutes at Sheffield United. And I don't think Southampton are going to be any worse than Sheffield United were last year. So he's a pretty solid pick. The fixtures, again, first 5, you've got 3 home games. Forest at home in 2, Man United at home in 4, and Ipswich at home in 5. The away games are Newcastle away game week 1 and Brentford away game week 3. So not a perfect set of fixtures by any means, but not terrible either. So I think, I don't know if I could put him ahead of the other two, but I think he is right up there. And you could argue because of the fixtures in the short term, like first 3 game weeks, maybe even should be ahead of Minter. But I think they are the top 3. Just to quickly talk about the others, with Solanke gone and who now probably not fit to start the season, Semenyo could play central and basically be their number 9. And we've seen him get returns previously for Bournemouth. So not a bad option in the short term, but losing someone like Solanke for that much money, Bournemouth are going to buy another forward. It's almost a certainty. So how long Semenyo keeps playing centrally, I just don't know. And also, I don't think Bournemouth's fixtures are that great longer term. Like if I just pull him up here, I think you could have gone for Solanke if he was still there just because of what he offers. But after Forest away, Newcastle at home and Everton away, so 2 away games the first 3, you then have Chelsea at home and Liverpool away. It gets a bit better after that. But overall, I just don't fancy those fixtures, and I think they will go into the transfer market. Kamada's numbers last year were pretty poor. His career stats are better, so there is definitely promise there. He's worked under Glasner before, got a goal in a pre-season friendly recently too. I don't think his minutes are completely guaranteed, but I'd be surprised if he doesn't start the season. And I quite like Crystal Palace's fixtures, but I think with Smith Rowe, you've probably got a better chance at regular minutes, similar with Bruyne and Diaz, and their individual numbers are probably going to be quite similar. So Kamada's not really one for me. And McNeil is just the ultimate boring pick, right? 0.1 expected goals per 90. Very rarely scores. I think he averages just under 3 goals or around 3 goals a season. He can get you assists as well, and Everton's fixtures aren't terrible, but you're not likely to get a huge amount of goals from him. There's players on this list where that will happen, and obviously goals for midfielders are just worth 2 extra points over assists anyway. So McNeil gives you the guaranteed minutes, but not much more than that. So I think for me in the short term, it's definitely Smith Rowe. Just to have a quick look at some of the other 5.5 million midfielders here. Aston Villa, I think most people are going to go for Rodgers if they go for someone cheap, and he's obviously at 5. Kluivert took a penalty in pre-season for Bournemouth, but again, I don't think it's a guarantee he's now their first choice penalty taker, and his minutes, he'll probably start quite regularly, but does sometimes get sobbed off early. So I think if I was going for one of them, it would probably be Semenyo, but not much in it. I think Brentford have got too many other options to worry about, like Sharda, for example. Adingra is definitely not nailed on. And then there's not really a huge amount of other picks, like Andreas possibly at Fulham. If he stays, he'll be on penalties, but he might play deeper. And there is a chance that he could get sold. That kind of rumour will not go away. So I think I would just buy Smith Rowe instead. So for me, if I go for a 5.5, I'm pretty sure it's going to be Smith Rowe. Maybe Minter next, but I think because of the fixtures, I might be tempted by Brereton Diaz. So I've just loaded up the points prediction tool on Fantasy Football Hub to see who the AI is predicting as the best 5.5 million midfielders. And I've set it to the first 6 game weeks. If you want to check this tool and all the other stuff they've got out for yourself, it's 50% off at the moment. As always, links in the description below. So the best midfielder they've got is Brereton Diaz, who was 3rd on my list. And I do think, given what we saw him do for Sheffield United, plus the fixtures they've got, not a terrible pick whatsoever. It's Kluivert and Semenyo in 2 and 3. That is probably because their minutes go up with no Solanke, and one of them's going to take penalties as the most likely outcome, depending on if they sign anyone else. So I don't hate those picks, but I do think the fixtures in the short term are not fantastic, and any new signing could make them worse FPL picks. Hudson-Odoi in 4th. He was very popular when FPL first launched. I just don't know if I trust the minutes enough. But the short-term fixtures, Bournemouth at home, Southampton away and Wolves at home, very good, especially if you're going for a more aggressive strategy. Then it's Minter, who we talked about. Then McNeil. Then it's Murphy at Newcastle, who I haven't mentioned at all. He could start game week 1. And he did play quite a lot last year. Even when Harvey Barnes was back, it was Gordon left wing and Murphy right wing quite a lot. So maybe that continues. But I'd just be worried that Gordon and Barnes could start some games. But in the short term, where the fixtures are good for Newcastle, you could maybe take a punt on Murphy, and then it's Smith Rowe. So Smith Rowe is actually quite a bit further down. I just like the punt now. I just think if the minutes are good with the fixtures they've got, he's going to be a decent pick. But as always, it's going to depend on how much game time you think these players are going to get. But yeah, like I said, if you want to check all this stuff out, links in the description. Let's get on to some questions. So the first question is similar to what a lot of people asked. Are we overhyping Nkunku as an option to start the season? He said his main goal is to stay fit. Chelsea have an influx of attacking players, and there are European midweek games in August. Now, with those European games, it's Europa Conference League playoff matches. My assumption would be that Nkunku and the other first 11 players will get heavily rotated. I could be wrong, but that's not something I'm particularly worried about. In terms of whether he's being overhyped, I guess that depends on what your expectations are. Like, he's in my squad because when I look at the 6.5 million midfielder bracket, in terms of footballing ability, he's right up there. His record was really good before he came to Chelsea. He's just a quality player. I don't necessarily expect him to be the next Mo Salah or the next Cole Palmer or something like that. I just think there's a good chance at 6.5 he will get me a good amount of returns, and there's a good chance that he's one of the best options. And they've got okay fixtures. Like, that's about it. I'm not expecting him to go and score 10 goals in the first 10 matches, but I think he can return enough for 6.5 to be value, and he does have a shot at, you know, not making necessarily a mockery of 6.5, but outscoring that price tag. Like, that's it for me. I'm not expecting the world, but I do expect that he can get me something. In terms of his main goal is to stay fit, that kind of makes sense as something to say given what happened last year. I think the minutes he's had in pre-season is very encouraging. Can he hold up when Premier League matches, the tempo, the intensity starts? We'll have to wait and see. But if he's fit and available, like, he's in for me. And the influx of attacking players, I mean, that's just Chelsea, right? I'm sure at the time I'm recording this, they're probably buying someone else. By the time it goes live tomorrow morning, they'll have bought a second player as well. But I just don't expect them to sign too many players that are better than Nkunku. And I think he'll be first choice. With the number of options they've got, it's absolutely probably correct that he won't be a 90-minute man. We should expect early subs, given his fitness record at Chelsea and the players they've got. But I think regular starts will be a thing. So are we overhyping him? I mean, I'm not. Yes, he's been in a lot of my drafts because I think he's a good pick. But that's all there is to it. I don't think he's necessarily anything special. I just think he's got a good shot at getting FPL returns. And it could be wrong, but who knows until the football starts. So why do you think Havertz is being overlooked? If Jesus does start, Havertz slots into midfield, but Jesus is usually subbed early and Havertz is generally a 90-minute man. So I agree with all that. It's not very often that Havertz is benched, and he's either going to start as a 9 or he'll start a bit deeper, and if Jesus does go off, he'll move more advanced. And when he plays as a number 9, the numbers are really good. His returns last season were decent too. He is a good pick. But why is he being overlooked? That's pretty simple. The closer we get to the Game Week 1 deadline, the more and more people are going to go for Haaland, so that's one spot taken up. Isak is super popular, and for 0.5 million more than Havertz, you get guaranteed number 9. Not much competition because Callum Wilson's currently out. And even when Callum Wilson is back, Isak will start when he's fit and available. And he's on penalties, guaranteed. Whereas Havertz doesn't have penalties. We know that's Saka. And then next in line is probably Odegaard. So that's 2 of your slots taken up. And then after that, the way that a lot of people are structuring their FPL squads, they just don't have 8 million to spend on that third forward slot. You've got Solanke for 0.5 less at Spurs, who's going to play number 9. João Pedro at 5.5, Meniz at 6 million. There's just quite a few forward options. And once Haaland and Isak are in, for a lot of people, there's only one more spot and that's it. It doesn't make Havertz a bad pick. If you want to go for him, you absolutely should. I think when he plays as a number 9, he's great. The fixtures are pretty good for Arsenal. But it is difficult to make a case to go for him over someone like Isak. And fitting him in as that third player is tough. And if you go for the cheaper option, like a Meniz, for example, you save 2 million, you can probably then go and spend that in midfield because at the 6 million price point, there's not as many good midfielders, I would say. There's lots of options at 5.5, but I don't think any of them are better than Meniz, for example. So then it just comes down to combination. So if it's Havertz and a 5.5 million midfielder, or let's say a Meniz and a Jota or Meniz and Gordon, I think I prefer the latter combination. And by the way, this always happens in FPL where players get overlooked. But it's just circumstantial. It's just based on fixtures, price, the alternative options as well. And it's not because Havertz is terrible. It's just that most of the time there's a better way to spend your money. So everyone is hyping up Solanke. Is he suddenly essential, or would a 7.5 million midfielder be better? I would say that Solanke is a good, solid pick. To the point of, if you want him in your squad, great, he's decent, you should do that. And if you don't want him, that's fine too. He's not suddenly must-have just because he's moved to Spurs. I think in terms of him as an FPL pick, he will get more chances at Spurs than Bournemouth. We would expect Spurs to score more goals. But also on the flip side, Son will probably keep penalties. It's certainly not a guarantee that Solanke will get them. And it might be that his minutes aren't quite so good. Now, before everyone says he's definitely going to start, I agree. Right? At least early on, I don't see him being benched or anything like that. But at Bournemouth, he was a 90-minute man pretty much every single game. Spurs have other options, like Richarlison has not been sold. He's still there. And so he could get subbed on for Solanke later on in games. So it might be that Solanke gets subbed off at 70, 75, 80 minutes, whatever it might be. You don't get the full 90 anymore. But obviously that's counteracted with being in a better team and getting better chances. So I think the likelihood is he becomes a better FPL pick at Spurs. I've been thinking about this quite a lot and going back and forth. I think it's likely he becomes a better pick, but not to the point where he's suddenly essential and has to be in your team. So that's kind of how I view it right now. But I think he will start regularly. I also think he'll start in game week 1. Ange Postecoglou's already kind of implied that could happen. Van de Ven, when he was signed last year, I think he played like 4 days later with no pre-season with Spurs. So Solanke should be fine for game week 1. In terms of whether a 7.5 million midfielder would be better, my instinct is no, but I need to quickly look at the list of 7.5 million midfielders. So Jota and Diaz could do really well, but long-term the minutes are somewhat of a concern because we're not quite sure how Slot is going to set Liverpool up. I think Anthony Gordon is a really solid pick if he stays at Newcastle. He always plays, but I think because of the goal threat, I'd probably have Solanke as better. Maddison is a no-go for me. I think Jared Bowen at some point could be a good option, and he's not terrible from the start, but West Ham's fixtures, they're okay. They could be better, I would say. So I think compared to the 7.5s for guaranteed minutes, he probably is the one longer term. Short term, you could say that Jota, if he's going to play as the number 9 for Liverpool, you know, it's definitely good competition for Solanke. But I think you can almost guarantee starts for Solanke. I don't think you can do that for Jota after like game weeks 3 or 4 or something like that. So I think he holds up pretty well versus the 7.5 million midfielders. But obviously you've got those combinations again. So it could be Solanke and Smith Rowe or Jota and João Pedro. And then suddenly it gets a little bit trickier to decide. It's quite close in that regard. I'll have a quick look on the points prediction for 7.5 million players in general. I'm not going to look at anyone cheaper than that. And I'm going to go for midfielders and forwards to see who's at the top. So first 6 game weeks, they've got Bowen, then Jota. This is on Fantasy Football Hub again. Then Gordon, then Solanke in 4th place. Now, it is worth pointing out that midfielders obviously get an extra point for a goal, point for a clean sheet as well. And the points totals are quite close, to be honest. But I think that shows that Solanke hasn't suddenly become essential. He might be better than all 3 of those picks, but probably not in such a way where we should all be kind of restructuring our squads to get him in. So good pick. You should definitely have him if you want, but not essential. So is João Pedro overrated and actually a risk considering Brighton's first few fixtures are pretty hard, plus Brighton's new manager who has minimal experience? So just on Hurtzler, I'm not really worried about that, mostly because it's Brighton, and they tend to get more things right than they get wrong with recruitment of staff and players. So I think the manager will probably do okay, plus they've just got a good squad. So I think they'll be fine in that regard. In terms of whether he's overrated and a risk, that really, again, depends on your expectations, like I spoke about with Nkunku, and what minutes you think João Pedro will get. If you think he's going to get benched regularly, then yes, he's a terrible pick and you shouldn't go for him. If you think he's going to start regularly and get pretty decent minutes, well, all of a sudden you've got a 5.5 million forward who takes penalties in a good team that is going to be fairly attacking. And that's quite hard to find in FPL. It's not often you get forwards at that price that offer potentially all of what João Pedro can offer. So yes, the fixtures are quite difficult, but you've got 2 ways of playing it, right? You can do what I spoke about in my last draft video or my team selection video, where I'll probably play João Pedro game week 1, but then I could bench him game weeks 2 and 3 for Smith Rowe and just use him as part of a rotation. Or you could set up your squad where you're playing João Pedro every week. And yes, he doesn't have the greatest fixtures. Man United at home 2, Arsenal away 3, Chelsea away 6, Spurs at home 7. But if he's in your 11 all the time, that is because you've chosen to spend all your money elsewhere. So the rest of your squad is looking good. And your 11th pick in João Pedro is potentially just great value. So I think he's a solid option. I don't think there's a guarantee that his minutes long term are great. Brighton could sign more players in the transfer window. And if he does start off badly and becomes popular but ahead of the deadline, his price could drop ahead of those tougher fixtures. But I just look at it and think, if you think the minutes are good, which I personally think they're probably going to be decent enough, he's just a good pick. And I think that's all there is to it. Whether he's overrated really depends on what you think people are saying about him, I guess. Again, I don't think he is the next Haaland, but I think for 5.5 he's good. I will say this, though. For 0.5 million more, yes, you lose penalties, but you can get Muniz at Fulham. And his attacking threat from open play for goals is very good, or it was last year on kind of 1,500 minutes. So we are on a small sample size, but it was decent. The fixtures are good, and I'm pretty sure he is nailed to start. Like, Raul Jimenez will get minutes, but I wouldn't expect Muniz to be benched anytime soon. So if you want that kind of, I mean, you might see it as safety for 0.5 million more, you can have that. But is João Pedro overrated? No, I just think he's a pretty good pick. So how many players like Jota, Darwin and Bob, who are high potential, high risk, would you have in your Game Week 1 squad? Now, this depends on a few things. First of all, what type of FPL manager are you? If you've played in the past and gone for picks like this, and then at the first sign of a bench and you've got super frustrated, I'd keep them to a minimum. Because being able to play the game and manage your squad without being on tilt, I think is underrated. And by going for players that are safe for minutes, it might be a bit more boring. The upside might not be there, but they're hassle-free, right? There's less things that can go wrong. So think about that. I'd also consider when you might want to wildcard. The consensus that goes around this season seems to be that an early wildcard is probably better than previous ones. And there's a few reasons for that. Players have gone up in price, and so an early wildcard might be a good way to build a bit of value. We've also had the Euros and Copa America, and so some players are late back. The transfer window is still going to be open for the first 3 game weeks. If you wildcard in kind of game weeks 4, where there's a few fixture swings as well, you've also got a lot more information. And the earlier you're going to wildcard, I think the more aggressive you can be with your initial squad. So definitely think of those things. As a general point, I don't know, the number that's coming up to me is like 1 or 2 is probably the most that I would go for. Because if you're not sure about their minutes long term, they soon become transfers. And don't kid yourself that, well, that's fine, right? I'll go for Bob and Jota, and when they're not playing anymore, I'll just transfer them out because the rest of the team looks good. Something will happen. Even for those hassle-free, guaranteed minutes picks, they could go and get themselves suspended. They could pick up an injury or something like that. Something will happen. There'll be other players that do really well that you suddenly want to go for. So I would probably keep it to like 1 or 2 so that you can keep transfers for other players. You also have to think about what the upside is versus other players at that price. So as an example, right, let's take Jota. He's super popular at the moment. At least he's being talked about quite a lot because he started the last game in what you would probably consider the first choice 11 for Liverpool in the friendly. I think it was against Sevilla as the number 9. He's a great finisher. He will get chances, and obviously Liverpool's fixtures are good. So really solid option. He's 7.5 million. And then you look at someone like Anthony Gordon at the same price. Well, they've got Southampton at home, Bournemouth away, Spurs at home, Wolves away and Fulham away. So the fixtures aren't that bad for an attacker. He doesn't cost any more than Jota. And you know when he's fit and available, he always starts. So Jota might outscore Gordon, but it's not a guarantee. So you have to ask yourself whether that upside is enough, because Jota will definitely be lower owned. He is more of a differential, but being a differential doesn't necessarily guarantee you more points. So you have to think about what the upside is over that safer pick. With someone like Bob, for example, his main competition really is Carvalho at Brentford. He's obviously moved from Liverpool. I don't think his minutes are going to be great initially. And Rodgers at Villa. There's not a huge amount of other 5 million standouts. So in that case, Bob might be worth the risk because he also plays in a team that will score a lot of goals, and he's got Ipswich at home in game week 2. And you know that if he keeps playing, that price will absolutely skyrocket. So I'd almost say like a Bob versus a Rodgers is more worth going for than a Jota versus a Gordon. Not to say you shouldn't go for Jota, but hopefully that kind of makes sense that maybe the upside is not quite as high as it would be for a different pick like Bob. But for me, it'd probably be like 1 or 2 picks. I think it's fine, by the way, just to go for a punt at the start of the season. Like, as much as we've got historical data to go on in terms of expected goals, expected assists for players and teams, there is a lot of unknowns at the moment. And so going for the odd kind of player is fine. And you've got the wild card to kind of back you up if you need it. And the fact that you can now roll 5 transfers and roll transfers through a wild card is also more reason to use it a little bit earlier. So maybe 3 is the maximum. I think once you start going to 4, 5, 6, there's so many things that could go wrong at once. It might force you into doing things like hits and transfers or wild cards you might not want to do. But 1, 2, or 3, it's probably okay. So this is a good follow-on question. Would you go for Jota or Darwin for the first 3 game weeks? Also, is Robertson over Trent worth it to fund Darwin to Isak? So on the first question, I would go for Jota simply because he's been back from the Euros longer than Darwin has been back from Copa America. That is the only reason that I would choose Jota instead. I think long-term, no one knows for sure who is going to be the preferred number 9 for Arne Slot. In fact, a few weeks ago, people were saying that Darwin Núñez is the one that he's earmarked, but we don't know that for sure. So all we've got to go on is pre-season minutes. It is not a guarantee that Jota will start game week 1, and even if he does, he might not start game week 2. But I think given what we've seen so far, he's probably got the highest chance of doing that. And as a general point, this is the way that I'm viewing it. Any player that you're going for because you think the competition is a little bit further behind in terms of pre-season minutes, I think they've got 3 game weeks maximum until there's a bit of a reset, because you've got 3 game weeks and then the international break. And at that point, players have had enough time to get up to speed. The transfer window is shut. There's a reset there. So if Jota is preferred because of pre-season, 3 weeks feels to me like the maximum. If Slot wants Darwin to be the first choice number 9, that will happen by game week 4 at the latest, I would say. So there's risk there, but you already know that if you're picking Liverpool attackers. Robertson over Trent to fund Darwin to Isak. I would definitely find $1 million to do Darwin to Isak, because there's no guarantee that Darwin starts, and Isak absolutely will. He's on penalties, etc. I'm not going to go through all that again. So I would find the best way to free up $1 million. Downgrading Trent could be that. I am definitely considering downgrading him to boost other areas of my squad. It won't be for Robertson. If you want to go for a Liverpool defender for guaranteed game time and it's not Trent, it's got to be Van Dijk. Tsimikas started that friendly for Liverpool that looked like the first choice 11, and Robertson has been carrying a bit of an injury over pre-season. Now, he started the second game on that day that Tsimikas started with what looked like the first 11, but it's not a guarantee who will start in game 1. Long term, Robertson will be the first choice left back, almost certainly, but Tsimikas might get the first game week or 2, and so it's just not worth it. If you're going to do Trent downgrade to a Liverpool defender to get Isak, it's got to be Van Dijk. So I'm not sure why no one fancies De Bruyne. I know he missed pre-season, but he was at the Euros. City will score so many goals, and I love the Haaland and De Bruyne combination. Now, I think it's perfectly reasonable to want more Man City attackers. They will be in the top 3 for goals scored this year, and Ipswich at home in game week 2 is likely to be one of the best fixtures you'll get all season. And for what it's worth, he did miss a lot of pre-season because he was away with Belgium, but he's not in the same bracket as like a Foden or a Walker or a Rodri. He was back sooner than that, and he came off the bench in the Community Shield. So there's a very good chance that he will start against Chelsea in game week 1. And because you haven't got Champions League and stuff like that at the start of the season, you've got an extra... It's like a week's rest between games. He'll probably start against Ipswich as well. So he is a nice differential. I think the reason that he's probably being overlooked compared to other midfielders in and around that price is just because of what you get by paying 0.5 million more. Like for Saka or Son, you've got players with more goal threat, and they're also on penalties, and they're absolutely nailed on. Now, for what it's worth, I think that De Bruyne will start way more than he doesn't, but he is getting a bit older now, and he did have that injury last year, which kept him out for a while, then he was managed. It might be that when Champions League kicks back up again, that he does get rested a little bit more often than what we've maybe seen in the past. And I think for 9.5 million, I just find it difficult to kind of justify that. And he is very good when he gets an attack and return. He's one of those players that, like, if he gets an assist, that's probably worth, instead of 3 points, like 4 or 5, because he always gets bonus points alongside it. But his attacking threat is more skewed towards assists, which are worth 3 points generally. Whereas those that score goals, you get 5 points every time. It's just worth so much more. And if we look at the underlying numbers from last year, so if I just pull up the expected goal data on Hub, so De Bruyne was 0.18 non-penalty expected goals, 0.51 expected assists. So his expected goal involvement combined is good, but it is just way more skewed towards those assists. You look at Saka, for example, for 0.5 more, 0.32 non-penalty expected goals, 0.33 expected assists. So I would essentially expect Saka to outscore De Bruyne over a number of game weeks, plus his minutes are probably slightly better, and he's on penalties as well. And ultimately, if I want a Man City attacker long term, I'd probably just go for Foden at the same price. I think at the start of the season, it's a bit more of a difficult call because Foden probably will miss game week 1, and therefore De Bruyne is probably the slightly better option if you want to go for someone for that Ipswich at home fixture. But that is why he's being overlooked. The minutes haven't been great in pre-season, although I do think he'll start against Chelsea. There is maybe slightly more risk about rotation than previous seasons. And players at that same price point, like Foden or slightly more, I just think have more advantages for FPL. Again, it's not that he's a bad pick. It's like Havertz. If you want to go for him, you should. He's a big differential, but that is why people are overlooking him. So this is a slightly different question. How hard should we hit the panic button when it all falls apart midway into the weekend? Now, first of all, you definitely shouldn't panic, right? There's still 37 game weeks to go, and it might be that your players had an off day and they're going to be better from game week 2 onwards. But I think it is worth accepting that most of us will not get everything right this season. Of course, someone has to win it, and they will make consistently good picks, get a bit of luck along the way, of course, right? But for most of us, that's not going to happen. So just accept now that you will make good choices, and they will not always pay off. If it does happen, where you have a terrible game week, get off social media, because everyone will be posting their good scores, and sometimes that's annoying to look at, even though they're fully in their rights to do that, and I encourage it. But get off social media and sleep on it. The worst thing you can do is make rash decisions on that. Let's just say you go through Friday and Saturday, it's a terrible week, and you want a wild card before you even see Sunday's games. Just sleep on it, because usually you'll feel better in the morning. But yeah, just as a general point, accept you will not always get it right. And yes, it's worse when it happens at the start of the season, but it can happen. So is it really wild to go for Martinelli or Trossard instead of Eze for game week 1? And I think part of the problem with considering doing something like this is you've named 2 players whose primary position for Arsenal is the same, right? Left wing. And so that tells me you're not quite sure about who is nailed on or who's going to get the most minutes. Whereas with Eze, unless there's loads of transfer speculation that he might leave, you know he's always going to start for Crystal Palace, plus he has penalties as well. Now, for what it's worth, Martinelli started the final pre-season game for Arsenal. I believe it was against Lyon. So I would guess against Wolves in game week 1, we'll see Martinelli, Havertz and Saka in that front 3. And so he could be worth a punt. He is going to be a massive differential. But as I've said before, he didn't play well last season. Not up to the standards we've seen before. And Trossard did get game time. Jesus is fit as well. He can play in that position. I'm just not sure it's really worth it. Like, if you want to go against Eze, that's fine, right? Just like loads of other players, he's not essential. He's a good, solid pick, but he's not the next Mo Salah or anything like that. But I think if I was going to spend 7 million on a midfielder that wasn't Eze, I just feel that there's too much uncertainty with those Arsenal players. And also, like in my last squad, in my team selection, I had Gabriel and Saka. Like, it might be that at some point I want an Odegaard or I want to have it. So I don't know if I want to block that by having Martinelli or Trossard. Like in Burmo, I think is a nice option at Brentford. He'll definitely start. If Tony ends up going, he'll take penalties. 2 of the first 3 fixtures are at home to Palace and Southampton. Longer term, or in general for the first 5, they've got to play Liverpool, City and Spurs all away. The first 3 aren't bad. You can get the lay of the land and then maybe transfer him on later. Even Rashford's probably going to get, I would say, more guaranteed minutes than either Martinelli or Trossard, and the fixtures aren't bad. Or, of course, you can just spend less money on a 6.5 or a 5.5, even a 5 million midfielder, and just spend money elsewhere. So, as you can probably tell, I love Eze. I think he's a good pick, but it's not even that with this question. I'm just not sure about Martinelli or Trossard. Like, my guess would be, if I was putting money on it, Martinelli will start, and if he plays well, he'll keep his place. But early substitutions are almost guaranteed. Like 70, 75 minutes, Trossard would be on. So I probably just wouldn't do it myself. But it ain't my team. If you want to do it, you absolutely should. Make sure to check out Fantasy Football Hub. Links in the description below. 50% off at the moment. Loads of tools over there to help you do better at FPL this season. If you sign up and don't win your mini league, you will get your money back. Terms and conditions apply for that. I've put the links for those terms and conditions in the description as well. I know there's probably a few questions that I missed, but I'm going to do final thoughts on Friday. So anything else to cover, I can do that in that video. We'll have more stuff to come tomorrow and probably later today as well. So make sure you hit a like on this video and subscribe so you don't miss any of the content in the run-up to Game Week 1 and throughout this season. Otherwise, rate 5 stars on podcast before I forget. And I'll see you later. Thanks for watching.